John had seen his fair share of strange occurrences on his farm over the years. From rogue raccoons raiding his cornfields to the occasional UFO sighting reported by his eccentric neighbor, Old Man Harris, nothing seemed to faze him anymore. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Margaret Maggie Thompson stomping through his rows of crops, clipboard in hand, squinting at his tomatoes like a self-appointed government inspector. The sun blazed overhead, casting a golden glow over the sprawling fields. Maggie's neon-pink sun visor reflected the sunlight, creating a ridiculous halo around her scowling face. She reached down, plucked a pepper straight from the vine, and took a dramatic sniff. Her nose scrunched up in disgust, and she dropped the pepper as if it were contaminated. "You call this organic?" she scoffed, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. "I read online that farmers like you use all sorts of chemicals. Who knows what you're putting in this soil?" John stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or demand an explanation. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath. "Maggie, what the hell are you doing on my farm?" She turned to face him, her expression filled with righteous indignation, as if he were the one trespassing. "Inspecting," she said matter-of-factly, as if she had been elected by the local government. "These crops are right next to our property line, and I have reason to believe there may be questionable substances involved." John wanted to laugh, but Maggie's dead serious expression made it clear she wasn't joking. This woman had been his neighbor for 3 years, and in that time, she had complained about everything from the color of his barn to the unnatural sound of his cows at dawn. But this was a new level of insanity. "That's ridiculous," John said, folding his arms. "You can't just waltz onto my property and start." "Oh, but I can," Maggie interrupted, holding up her clipboard like it was an official warrant. "According to the Homeowners Association guidelines, any potentially hazardous agricultural activity can be subject to investigation by concerned residents." John snorted. "Maggie, you live in a suburban cul-de-sac. I live on a farm. The HOA doesn't control what I do on my land." She narrowed her eyes, looking at him like he was a misbehaving student. "You'd be surprised what a little collective action can do, John. I already have a few neighbors on board, and we'll be taking this to the next meeting." John clenched his jaw. He could already picture the ridiculous HOA hearing, with Maggie standing in front of the board, making exaggerated claims about his suspiciously lush lettuce or unnaturally large zucchinis. He didn't have time for this nonsense. He had actual work to do. But Maggie wasn't done. She crouched down, pinched a handful of soil between her fingers, and let it trickle through her hands like some kind of expert. Then, with a disgusted expression, she wiped her hands on her pristine white capri pants. "Ew," she muttered. "Feels chemically." John ran a hand down his face, his patience thinning by the second. "That's dirt, Maggie. Just dirt." She shot him a skeptical look. "Because I've been doing research, and I know all about the things farmers use these days. You'd be surprised what they sneak into the soil: pesticides, hormones, genetically modified." "I grow organic," John interrupted, exasperated. "Always have." Maggie gave him a skeptical look, then bent down and poked one of his tomatoes. "Well, I suppose I'll have to take a sample for testing." That was it. That was the moment John decided she needed to be taught a lesson. He had spent years dealing with Maggie's nonsense, but if she wanted to treat his farm like a personal science experiment, he was going to make sure she regretted it. Casually, he turned toward his tool shed, making a show of checking his watch. "Well, if you're going to be here a while, let me just finish setting up today's irrigation schedule." Maggie barely acknowledged him, too busy jotting notes in her ridiculous clipboard. John walked to the control panel for his sprinkler system, a system he had upgraded last summer after noticing how well it deterred deer from his crops. The best part? It was motion-activated, covering every row of vegetables with a powerful high-pressure spray. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he toggled a few settings, ensuring the sprinklers would activate at maximum pressure the moment he stepped back. Then he turned and strolled back toward Maggie, who was now squinting at a row of cucumbers like they held government secrets. "Maggie," he called, suppressing a grin. "You might want to move." She barely looked up. "Excuse me, but I'm conducting important research." John shrugged. "Suit yourself." The sprinklers erupted. A sudden, violent blast of water shot up from the ground, drenching Maggie from head to toe. She shrieked, flailing as powerful jets pounded her designer blouse, sending her sun visor flying into the mud. The clipboard, Her precious clipboard went soaring through the air before landing with a wet splat in a puddle. "What is happening?" she screamed, spinning in circles as the sprinklers rotated, hitting her from every angle. John pretended to look surprised, biting the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. "Oh, wow," he said. "Didn't expect that." Maggie stumbled backward, slipping in the mud, her arms pinwheeling before she landed flat on her, but in a freshly watered patch of soil. The sight was glorious. "You did this on purpose," she screeched, struggling to stand as water continued to pummel her. "Maggie," John said, feigning innocence. "You know I have to keep my crops properly irrigated. It's a farm, after all." She tried to storm off, but her shoes were caked in mud, and her once pristine white pants were now a soaking, brown-streaked disaster. Furious and humiliated, she pointed a trembling finger at John. "This isn't over," she hissed before slipping again, barely catching herself before falling face first. John just watched, arms crossed, as she finally managed to stumble away, leaving a trail of wet, muddy footprints behind her. As she disappeared down the road, John turned back toward his field, inhaling the fresh scent of damp earth and victory. The sprinklers shut off automatically, the water dripping from the leaves like gentle applause. John grinned. Maybe now Maggie would think twice before deciding to inspect his farm again. John barely had time to savor his victory before the consequences of his little prank started rolling in. He knew Maggie wouldn't just slink away quietly. No, Maggie was the type to hold a grudge so tightly it would suffocate. Sure enough, as soon as she escaped the downpour of his sprinklers, she went marching toward her house with a soaking wet clipboard clutched to her chest like evidence in a high-profile lawsuit. John chuckled to himself as he turned off the system and surveyed his freshly watered field. If Maggie had learned her lesson, she wouldn't be coming back. But deep down, he knew better. She was probably already planning her next move, crafting some elaborate scheme to get back at him. John had to stay one step ahead. Later that evening, as he sat on his porch enjoying a well-earned glass of sweet tea, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from his neighbor, Hank. John already had a feeling about what this was going to be. "You really did it this time," Hank said, barely holding back his laughter. "Maggie's been going door to door, ranting about aggressive farming practices and chemical warfare." John exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You're joking." "Oh, I wish I were," Hank replied. "She knocked on my door 15 minutes ago, dripping wet, mud up to her knees, talking about how you've weaponized irrigation." John chuckled. "Well, she wanted an inspection. Thought I'd give her the full farm experience." "She's threatening to take it to the HOA," Hank warned. "Says you're violating community guidelines by creating an unsafe environment." John rolled his eyes. This was classic Maggie. The woman thrived on making mountains out of molehills. If she couldn't win by complaining to him directly, she'd try to drag some overblown authority into the situation. "She's wasting her time," John said. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over my land." "I've checked." "Yeah, well, you know how Maggie operates," Hank said. "She'll twist things until it sounds like you committed a felony." John wasn't worried. Maggie might throw a tantrum, but the HOA wasn't about to take away his right to water his own crops. Still, he knew he needed to be ready for whatever ridiculous plan she was cooking up next. Sure enough, the next morning, a black SUV pulled into his driveway, and out stepped Mr. Grayson, the head of the HOA. He was a man in his late 50s, always dressed like he was heading to a board meeting, even if he was just picking up his mail. He adjusted his tie as he approached, a clipboard of his own tucked under his arm. John sighed, setting down his shovel as Grayson stopped just short of the porch. "Let me guess," John said. "Maggie sent you." Grayson cleared his throat. "I received multiple complaints." "Multiple?" John raised an eyebrow. "Or just one very loud one?" Grayson ignored the comment, flipping through his papers. "It seems there's been an incident regarding excessive water usage, public safety concerns, and targeted harassment." John laughed. "Harassment? She trespassed on my farm, destroyed my crops, and started digging through my soil like she was on a crime scene investigation." Grayson gave a non-committal hum. "Well, Maggie claims you deliberately activated a high-powered sprinkler system while she was conducting a safety review." John leaned against his porch railing. "And did she mention this safety review was entirely self-appointed? Or that she ignored my warnings to leave?" Grayson hesitated. "Well, she does have concerns about potential pesticide use." Which is none of her business, John said. And for the record, I don't use pesticides. But even if I did, this is a farm, not a suburban flower bed. HOA rules don't apply here. Grayson frowned. He clearly didn't like being told there was something he couldn't control. Still, he said, adjusting his tie, we'd appreciate your cooperation in de-escalating neighborhood tensions. Perhaps an apology? John laughed so hard he nearly dropped his sweet tea. An apology? For what? Watering my crops. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. Maggie is influential in the community. Maggie is a menace, John corrected. Grayson exhaled, clearly realizing this conversation wasn't going in his favor. Well, he said, flipping his clipboard shut, just be mindful of your actions moving forward. We wouldn't want any unnecessary conflicts. John watched as Grayson walked back to his SUV, shaking his head. He knew exactly what that was, a warning wrapped in fake politeness. Maggie might not have the law on her side, but she had connections, and she was going to use every trick in the book to make his life difficult. That night, John set up a few cameras around the perimeter of his farm. If Maggie tried anything, he wanted proof. And knowing her, she wasn't done yet. The next morning, John got that proof. His sprinklers had been tampered with. Someone had snuck onto his property overnight and turned the valves to full blast, flooding one of his fields. He found the culprit's footprints in the mud, small, dainty shoe prints leading right back toward Maggie's property. John clenched his jaw. She had really done it now. Grabbing his phone, he pulled up the footage from his security cameras. Sure enough, there she was, creeping around his field under the cover of darkness, twisting the valves with the determination of a woman who had spent too much time watching revenge movies. John grinned. She wanted war? Fine. He took the footage straight to the sheriff's office. By noon, Maggie was in full meltdown mode. He heard the shouting before he even stepped outside, her voice shrill with indignation as she stood on his driveway, arms flailing. You called the police on me? She screeched. This is harassment. John leaned against his truck, arms crossed. Funny, I was thinking the same thing when I found my crops underwater. Maggie turned to the deputy standing beside her. This is absurd. He's lying. I was just... Just what? The deputy asked, unimpressed. Because we've got security footage that says otherwise. Maggie opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, she was speechless. John smirked. Maybe next time, Maggie, you should stick to inspecting your own backyard. She let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a growl, spun on her heel, and stormed off. The deputy handed John a copy of the report. Let us know if she tries anything else. Oh, John said, watching Maggie stomp back toward her house, I have a feeling this isn't over. John knew Maggie wouldn't let things go easily, but even he wasn't prepared for just how far she was willing to take her vendetta. For the next few days, she was surprisingly quiet, which, in itself, was a bad sign. Maggie wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was the type to retreat, regroup, and return with an even more ridiculous plan. Sure enough, the first sign of trouble came in the form of an official-looking letter from the HOA, stuffed into his mailbox like a ticking time bomb. He tore it open, already expecting nonsense, but even he had to pause at the sheer absurdity of what was written inside. According to the letter, the HOA had decided that his excessive water usage and unregulated farming practices were in violation of community standards. Effective immediately, he was being fined for creating an environmental hazard. The penalty? $5,000. John laughed out loud, standing in the middle of his driveway with the letter in hand. It was so ridiculous, he had to read it twice. $5,000 for watering his own crops? He could already see Maggie's smug face in his mind, picturing her sitting at home, sipping her overpriced tea, thinking she had finally won. But she hadn't. Not by a long shot. John drove straight to the HOA office, storming in with the letter in hand. The receptionist gave him a nervous glance, but barely had time to react before Mr. Grayson emerged from his office, looking entirely too pleased with himself. I assume you received the notice, Grayson said, his tone as smug as his neatly combed hair. John didn't even bother sitting down. You can't fine me for watering my own farm. Grayson adjusted his tie. The board has reviewed the complaints and determined that your irrigation system is excessive and could negatively impact local water supplies. John scoffed. Since when does the HOA control water rights? Last I checked, I wasn't part of your little cul-de-sac. Grayson gave a condescending smile. The HOA is responsible for ensuring harmony in the community. Multiple complaints have been filed. Let me guess, John interrupted. All from Maggie. Grayson cleared his throat, but didn't deny it. John shook his head, exhaling slowly to keep his temper in check. You do realize I have security footage of Maggie trespassing on my farm. And now you're trying to find me based on her nonsense. Grayson's smirk faltered just slightly. John took a step closer, lowering his voice. I also did some digging. Turns out Maggie's property line is not exactly where she thinks it is. She built part of that fancy fence of hers on my land. Legally, she's trespassing every single day. Grayson's face twitched. And while I was looking into property lines, John continued, I found something else interesting. You own that little Airbnb rental down the road, don't you? Grayson stiffened. John smirked. Funny thing, HOA rules explicitly prohibit short-term rentals in this neighborhood. But I guess it's different when it's your side hustle, huh? Grayson's jaw clenched. John folded the letter in half, tucking it into his pocket. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop this ridiculous fine. Maggie is going to stay off my land. And in return, I won't file official complaints about a certain illegal fence and a certain little rental operation. Grayson adjusted his tie again, swallowing hard. I'll review the complaint. Yeah, John said. You do that. The next morning, the fine disappeared. No official notice, no explanation, just gone, as if it had never existed. A few days later, John stepped outside to find a construction crew tearing down part of Maggie's fence. She was standing on her lawn, arms crossed, watching furiously as they dismantled her expensive landscaping. John took a slow sip of his coffee, enjoying the show. Maggie spotted him and stormed over, her shoes crunching against the gravel of his driveway. I hope you're happy, she snapped. John smiled. Oh, I am. She huffed, pointing a manicured finger at him. You think this is over? I know it is, he replied. Maggie opened her mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned on her heel and stomped back toward her house, muttering under her breath. For the first time in a long while, John felt genuine peace settle over his farm. No more unsolicited inspections, no more surprise sprinkler sabotage, no more HOA nonsense. Still, just in case, he installed a few extra sprinklers near the fence line. You know, for pest control. As the seasons changed, so did the dynamic between John and Maggie. While she never fully let go of her grudge, she learned to keep her distance. The farm flourished, and John's reputation as a no-nonsense farmer grew. He even started hosting community events, inviting neighbors to learn about sustainable farming practices. Maggie, of course, never attended. But John didn't mind. He had won the battle, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his peace. And as he stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over his fields, he knew that no matter what challenges came his way, he would always find a way to protect what was his. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.